My name is Ben, and I'm a night shift security guard at the Oakridge Mall. Oakridge used to be a heart of the city in the 90s. Now, it's a 3-story tomb of dead commerce. Most of the stores are boarded up with plywood or hidden behind heavy iron shutters. My job is simple: walk the perimeter, check the locks, and make sure the local kids don't break in to spray paint the fountain. The mall is a liminal space nightmare. When the sun goes down and the skylights turn black, the silence is so thick you can taste it. It smells like stagnant fountain water, floor wax, and old popcorn. I spend most of my shift in the security hub, a small room tucked behind the food court with a wall of 16 flickering monitors. At 2 a.m., I was watching camera 4, which covers the north wing near the old department store. The video quality is terrible. Everything is washed out in grainy grays and greens. I watched my own figure on the screen. I was doing my rounds, walking past a row of shuttered boutiques. I saw myself past the camera. I checked my watch. The feed has a 10-second digital delay. I watched the Ben on screen walk toward the edge of the frame. But then, the figure stopped. I froze in my chair. I looked at the door beneath my feet. I wasn't moving. I was sitting perfectly still in the hub. On the monitor, the version of me didn't keep walking. He turned around. He walked right up to the camera lens until his face filled the entire screen. It was my face. The same buzz cut, the same crooked nose, the same uniform. But his eyes were different. They weren't eyes. They were just flat, matte black circles, like holes poked in a photograph. The me on screen raised a hand and tapped on the camera lens. Tink, tink, tink. The sound didn't come from the speakers. It came from the hallway right outside the security hub. I stood up, my chair screeching against the linoleum. I grabbed my flashlight and my heavy ring of keys. My hands were sweating so much I nearly dropped them. I stepped to the heavy steel door of the hub and looked through the small reinforced glass slit. The hallway was empty. The dim emergency lights cast long orange shadows over the dusty tile. I looked back at the monitors. Every single screen had changed. Camera 1, the food court, showed me sitting at a plastic table, eating a meal that looked like a pile of gray ash. Camera 8, the atrium, showed me standing at the edge of the 3rd floor railing, looking down. Camera 12, the cinema, showed me sitting in the front row of Theater 4, watching a blank screen. I wasn't in any of those places. I was trapped in the hub. I realized then that the delay wasn't a glitch in the system. The mall was recording versions of me that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe versions of me that were already happening in the dark. I knew I had to leave. I didn't care about the job or the paycheck. I headed for the south exit, the one by the main parking lot. My footsteps echoed, bouncing off of the glass storefronts. I passed a clothing store called The Trend. The security gate was up, but the store was dark. Inside, a dozen mannequins stood in a circle. They were dressed in neon-colored windbreakers and faded jeans from 20 years ago. As I walked past, my flashlight beam swept over them. I stopped. I moved the light back. One of the mannequins wasn't wearing a windbreaker. It was wearing a security uniform. It was wearing my name tag. And its plastic, featureless face was slowly beginning to crack, revealing a wet, human eye peering from the porcelain. I didn't stay to see it open. I ran. I reached the south exit and slammed my weight against the push bar. It didn't budge. I tried my keys, fumbling through the ring, but none of them fit the lock. I looked through the glass doors at the parking lot. My car was sitting there, under a street lamp. But as I watched, the street lamp flickered and died. In the sudden darkness, I saw a figure walk up to my car. It moved with a jerky, mechanical gait. It reached into its pocket, pulled out a set of keys, and unlocked the driver's side door. It looked back at the mall entrance. It waved at me. Then, it got in my car and drove away. leaving me alone in the tomb. I stood frozen at the glass doors, watching the taillights of my own car vanish into the night. My breath fogged the pain. I was locked in, and the version of me that was supposed to be out there was gone. I turned back to the mall's interior. The silence was no longer empty. It felt crowded. It felt like a stadium full of people holding their breath, waiting for me to make a move. I decided to head toward the loading docks of the Grand Legacy department store. It was the biggest anchor store in the mall, 3 floors of hollowed-out boutiques and storage rooms. If the main exits were dead, the freight elevators might still have a manual override. As I walked, my flashlight beam hit the floor. The white tiles were covered in a thin layer of dust, except for a trail of wet footprints. They weren't from boots. They looked like bare feet, flat, damp, and perfectly shaped. They led from the fountain in the central atrium straight through the open security gate of Grand Legacy. I didn't want to follow them. Every instinct I had told me to sit in the middle of the bright atrium and wait for dawn. But the emergency lights were beginning to hum, a high-pitched whining sound that made my teeth ache. One by one, the overhead banks were flickering out. The darkness was reclaiming the mall, wing by wing. I decided to follow the wet tracks into the store. The air inside Grand Legacy was colder, smelling of mildew and old perfume. This was the mannequin graveyard. Because the store had closed so abruptly, they hadn't moved the displays. Dozens of plastic figures stood in clusters under plastic sheets. They looked like ghosts in the dark. I moved toward the back, heading for the employee stairs. My flashlight was beginning to dim. I shook it, the batteries rattling inside. Flicker. When the light came back, the cluster of mannequins to my left had shifted. Before, they were all facing the jewelry counters. Now, 3 of them were turned toward me. One of them, a male figure with no face, had its arm raised, pointing toward the ceiling. I didn't stop. I walked faster, my heart thumping against my ribs. I reached the storage area behind the menswear section. This was where they kept the parts. Dozens of headless torsos, crates of plastic arms, and bins of legs were stacked to the ceiling. I heard a sound, a soft, wet slap of a foot hitting the tile. I spun around, throwing my light behind me. The storage room was a maze of shelving units. I saw a flash of movement, a pale limb disappearing behind a rack of winter coats. I didn't say a word. I just kept moving, my keys jingling like a death knell in the quiet. I reached the freight elevator, and I hit the button. Nothing. The power was out in this wing. I turned to find the stairs, but the path I had just taken was blocked. A wall of mannequins had been moved into the aisle. There were at least 20 of them now. They weren't under sheets anymore. They were naked, their plastic skin gleaming like bone in my flashlight beam. They were packed together, shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid barrier. Flicker. The light went out for 2 seconds. When it returned, they were 3 feet closer. They weren't walking. There was no sound of footsteps. They were simply being in new positions every time I lost sight of them. One was now crouching, its plastic fingers inches from my boots. Another was reaching out, its hand positioned as if to grab my flashlight. I backed away, stumbling into the part bins. My hand landed on something cold and smooth. I looked down. It was a mannequin head, but it wasn't plastic. It felt like skin. I dropped it, and it hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud, not the hollow plastic clack that it should have made. I scrambled toward the back of the storage room, finding a heavy metal door labeled Maintenance Electrical. I burst through it and slammed it shut, sliding the deadbolt just as a heavy weight thudded against the other side. It wasn't a hand. It sounded like someone was swinging a plastic bat against the door. I was in a narrow service corridor that ran behind the stores. It was pitch black. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath, listening to the rhythmic thudding on the door. Then, the PA system crackled to life. It was the mall's midnight savings jingle from the 90s. A bright, upbeat pop song that sounded horrific coming through the distorted, dusty speakers. Beneath the music, I heard a voice, and it sounded like my voice. "Attention shoppers," my voice echoed, sounding calm and professional. "We are now closing. Please make your way to the nearest exit. Ben is waiting for you. Ben is always waiting." I looked up at the speaker in the ceiling. As the music played, I heard something else. It sounded like the sound of a camera shutter. I looked at the wall opposite me. There was a small red light blinking in the darkness, a hidden security camera. I realized then that I wasn't the guard anymore. I was the inventory. I looked down at my hands. In the dim red glow of the camera light, my skin looked pale, too pale. My joints felt stiff, as if they were being fused together by the cold. I tried to flex my fingers, but they moved with a slow, jerky resistance. The thudding on the door stopped. I heard the sound of a key turning in the lock. My key. The door began to creep open. A sliver of light from the storage room had spilled in, and I saw the shadow of the person standing there. He was wearing a security uniform, and he was holding a flashlight. He looked exactly like me. And as he stepped into the room, he reached out and clicked a button on his belt. The Ben in front of me began to grow warm and human, while I felt the first layer of hard, white porcelain begin to spread across my chest. The new Ben didn't lunge. He didn't growl. He simply stood there in the doorway, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the service corridor. The light felt like a physical weight against my eyes. I tried to shield my face, but my arm moved with a heavy, sickening creak. My skin wasn't just pale anymore. It was becoming translucent, like cheap wax, and then hardening into something cold and unyielding. I looked down at my hands. My fingernails had vanished, smoothed over by a layer of seamless white porcelain. I turned and bolted down the service corridor. I didn't have a choice. Running was like trying to move through deep water. My knees didn't want to bend. Every step sent a vibration through my legs that sounded like glass tapping on glass. Behind me, I heard the steady, relaxed pace of the other Ben's boots. He wasn't rushing. He knew I had nowhere to go. I burst through a set of double doors and found myself on the second-floor balcony of the central atrium. The mall was different now. The emergency lights had all turned to a deep, bruised red. Below me, the fountain was bubbling, but the water was thick and black like oil. The PA system was no longer playing music. It was playing the sound of a heartbeat, amplified until the glass railings rattled in their frames. I reached the escalator. It wasn't moving, so I began to climb down the frozen steps. Halfway down, the metal beneath my feet started to groan. The mall's automated lockdown system had triggered. I watched as the massive iron shutters began to descend from the ceiling, sealing off the wings one by one. The heavy metal grates hit the floor with a sound like a guillotine. I reached the bottom floor just as the final exit, the south exit where I'd seen my car, was buried behind an inch of reinforced steel. I was trapped in the heart of the tomb. I looked up. The new Ben was standing at the top of the escalator, looking down at me. He looked perfect. His skin was flush with color. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with the beautiful frantic energy of a living man. He reached out and touched the railing. He looked like he was enjoying the sensation of feeling the cold metal. I backed away, heading toward the center of the atrium, near the fountain. The mannequins were there. They had come out of the stores, hundreds of them. They weren't hiding anymore. They stood in the shadows of the kiosks, under the dead palm trees, and lined up along the balconies. They were all facing the center. They were all facing me. I looked at my reflection in the black water of the fountain. I didn't have a face anymore. My nose had smoothed into a gentle slope. My lips were gone, replaced by a painted, permanent line. My eyes were just two glass marbles, fixed and unblinking. I tried to scream, but there was no throat left to catch the air. There was only the hollow, plastic resonance of my chest. The Nuban walked down the escalator. He approached me slowly, his boots echoing across the tile. He stopped a few feet away. He reached out and adjusted my name tag. It was crooked. He straightened it with a gentle, mocking care. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver key. It was the key to the security hub. He leaned in close. I could smell the sweat on him, the smell of life. I could hear the wet slide of his tongue against his teeth. He didn't speak. He just smiled. It was my smile. He turned around and walked toward the security hub. I tried to grab him, to tear the life back out of him, but my arms locked in place. My joints had finally fused. I was a statue, frozen in a pose of desperation, one hand reaching out toward a world I no longer belonged to. I watched him enter the hub. A moment later, the monitors on the wall behind the glass flickered. On the screens, I saw the mall from a dozen different angles. In every single one, I saw a mannequin standing by the fountain. But as I watched, the images began to change. The monitors showed the Nuban punching the time clock. They showed him walking out of the mall as the sun began to rise. They showed him getting into my car, driving to my house, and sitting at my kitchen table. On the final monitor, camera 16, I saw the Nuban looking directly into the lens. He held up his hand. The skin on his palm was beginning to turn white. The loop was starting again. The lights in the mall finally died. The heartbeat over the PA system faded into a long, flat tone. The last thing I felt was the sensation of a heavy plastic sheet being draped over my head. Someone, one of the other Bens from the shadows, was tucking the edges around my feet, preparing me for storage. I was just inventory now, and the mall was always fully stocked.